Hey y'all, it's Miss Siddiqui here. In this video, I'm going to talk about integrating evidence into a literary analysis paper. So we'll cover why to use evidence, when to and when not to use evidence, how to pick evidence that strengthens your points, and how to integrate and explain evidence seamlessly. So a literary analysis essay that you write for English must be your essay. But you're going to use quotes to support your ideas and to support your argument around a text. So, a literary analysis essay typically focuses on a commentary on the author's choices and the impact of those choices, or the theme of a work. So, we use quotes to prove that our ideas about a text are correct, to illustrate our point of view about a text or the author's choices or the theme, and to demonstrate how we arrived at our original ideas about a piece of text or literature. So, quoting is one thing that we do, but there are alternatives to quoting to present textual material as evidence for our arguments. You can refer to textual data, you can summarize, you can paraphrase. Sometimes you might just want to refer to points or sections in a piece, such as saying, in Act 2, this happens. That doesn't require that you use a quote. You can just refer to sections or chapters or pages in a book. In other cases, you'll just want to paraphrase or translate the text in your own words. So that's called paraphrasing, and then summarizing is kind of a broader version of paraphrasing. So make sure that you are thinking about, is it crucial for me to quote this line? So summarize or paraphrase when it is not so much the language of the text that justifies your position, but the substance or content. Quotes are supposed to be specific, particular evidence for a specific, particular claim. So make sure you know the difference between quoting and the alternatives to quoting. So your writing is powerful, and quotes support that power. So you need to use quotations sparingly to supplement the power of your own writing. So quote only words or sentences that will be that supplement. Don't quote to tell the story or convey basic information about the text. That should come from your own words. So don't quote for the sake of quoting. Be purposeful about why you are quoting. Remember, use quotes that support the power of your writing. So usually you will not use a quote in your essay's introduction. An introduction should typically be in your own words unless you're trying to use a quote as some sort of hook. So you shouldn't use quotes in the introduction. When to use quotes happens in the body paragraphs as support for claims. So quotes should appear in the middle section of your essay, but they should not appear at the top of a paragraph. Paragraphs start with topic sentences. Now remember, a topic sentence tells the reader what the rest of the paragraph will be about, and that should be in your own words. So don't start with a quote, that should come after your claim. So after you've given the topic sentence and explain what you will be writing about in your paragraph, you can consider using a quote that proves or illustrates what you claimed in your topic sentence. In other words, you need to prove your claim in the topic sentence using the quote. Then after the quote, and this is the most important part, is showing how the quote supports your point. This must be in your own words. And this must explicitly demonstrate the connection between your idea, your claim, and the quote you've used. So this should implicitly explain to the reader why you chose the quote and why it's relevant to your main point. The quote does not make your point for you. And finally, don't end a paragraph with a quote. Don't leave quotes hanging there and make your audience do the work to figure out how the quote fits into your literary argument. Choosing a quote is the first step, but then the cognitive work comes in when you explain the relevance of the quote and you unpack that quote for your audience to support the idea you're trying to convey. So don't lead up to the quote and then just plop it in there. You need to explain afterwards. So the quote actually should come early on in that paragraph, and then the rest should be a lengthy explanation. How to pick quotes. Select quotes carefully and purposefully for literary analysis essays. Make sure that that quote is actually illustrating or explaining the opinion or idea in the topic sentence. That quote should provide authority for the assertion that you've made about the author's choices or about the theme. And then the quote can also provide a focal point for a claim you're making, or it can show many perspectives. Use the acronym SPIES to help you remember that you need to create meaningful commentary after quotes. SPIES stands for significance, purpose, importance, effect, or suggestion. Do not simply paraphrase the quote in your commentary. You can explain further what the quote is saying, but then you should also explain why you put it there, what does it show, how does it support this thesis, why is it significant. All quotes need explanation and/or commentary following the quote. So you are to analyze, explain, and interpret the quote for your reader. So comment on the significance of the quote as it relates to the point you're making, explain how it supports the overall thesis. This is kind of the mandatory part of a literary analysis essay, is making the actual commentary. So let's talk about integrating quotes. Some of the basics. You need to be meticulous and exact in the copying of your quotes. Change nothing unless you've indicated that you've done so with brackets, and I'll talk about that later. Place quotation marks around copied words. And remember that a quote can be narration or dialogue, it doesn't matter which. And then take the shortest quote necessary to make your point. Excerpt quotes, you don't have to take the full line that an author says. You can take pieces of it, and you can piece pieces together. So all direct quotes should be connected to your words with what's called a lead-in. This lead-in should establish a context for your quotes. In other words, you should indicate the speaker, if that's applicable, or the situation. For example, the underlined and bolded portion of this lead-in below provides context. So, when George tells Peter that he is turning off the nursery, Peter responds by saying, "I wouldn't want the nursery locked up." James 14, period. So the underlined portion is a lead-in to the actual quote which we have taken. So you need to give us the situation of where the quote is actually taking place, be it dialogue or narration. Dialogue requires single quotation marks inside the double only when both narration and dialogue appear in your chosen text. Try to avoid this if you can. Instead, have your lead-in clarify the speaker of the dialogue and quote to make this simpler. A citation should appear after any and all quoted material. The citation tells the reader where the quote comes from, and it will consist of the author and page number. The citation of the quoted material follows the end quotation mark, but precedes the end mark for the whole sentence. So, for example, the period comes after parentheses James 14. The exception to this occurs when the quote includes a question mark or exclamation point. This punctuation must appear in addition to the final end mark because it is a part of the meaning of the quote. So, for example, in this section, when Lydia remarks that the screams coming from her children's nursery sound familiar, her husband expresses concern. Do they? James 14, period. Notice how taking out the question mark would change the meaning of the quote. So it's important to include that. So that's the one exception for the end punctuation coming before the parentheses citation. So all quotes should have lead-ins. Some are formal and some are informal. A formal lead-in is intended for complete sentence quotes only. So introducing the quote with a complete sentence or an independent clause followed by a colon is called a formal lead-in. So for example, the lead-in would be, as the aunt tries to convince their nephew of the police officer's kindness, the reader cannot help but view the aunt as extremely misguided. That's a complete sentence. And then, followed by a colon, we have the quoted textual evidence. Mortimer, I don't think the police would pry into our private affairs if we asked them not to. So this is a formal lead-in. We've got a complete sentence followed by a colon followed by our textual evidence. We can also use informal lead-ins or signal phrases. So your words introduce the quote, and your words will not be a complete sentence. They can be used for quotes that are either complete sentences or shorter than that. In other words, use them for sentence quotes or keyword and key phrase quotes. Instead, they will consist of a lead-in with a launch word plus a comma or a lead-in that transitions into the quote with the word that. So you could say, the author says that, or this character says that. So some examples. Mortimer says, comma, and then insert the quote. Or you can include the lead-in at the end and say, as Lydia expresses chagrin over the room's unwillingness to change for her or George, she asserts the room's in a rut. So you can sort of hybridize adding the context and the lead-in and the quote to have a shorter, simpler sentence. Some sample launch words include says, asserts, thinks, believes, ponders, claims, reports, suggests, reasons, thinks, writes, recalls, etc. You should use a comma when you introduce a quotation with phrases such as according to Mortimer or Mortimer tells Elaine. Some other signal phrases can be the author says, the author believes, and these are some more basic ones, but this is a good starting place. So when you quote textual evidence, you might want to use ellipses to indicate an interruption in the quotation. You might not need all of the quotation. Remember, we want to use the most important and the most valuable parts. So, for example, the original is, Martha says, Mortimer, we know the police better than you do. I don't think they'd pry into our private affairs if we asked them not to. For the ellipted essay, you could say, Martha says, Mortimer, ... I don't think they'd pry into our private affairs if we asked them not to. No ellipses are necessary for short key phrase quotes, or for key words. And do not use ellipses to indicate that you have left out the beginning of a sentence. Only missing words from the end or somewhere in the middle of a sentence need to be indicated with ellipses. The same applies to eliminated sentences in between other parts of sentences.